Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on the economic costs of the PennEast Pipeline and FERC's failure to consider them. My name is Bridget Brady, and I'm an assistant to Maya at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. Maya had planned to be on tonight hosting, but has had to tend to a family obligation at the last minute. So if there are any reporters on the call who want to speak to Maya, she will be available later this evening or tomorrow by phone. But please feel free to ask any questions of our experts tonight. I think that most of you are aware of who we are, but for those of you who are new, Maya Van Rossum is the Delaware Riverkeeper, and she leads the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, a nonprofit working throughout the entire Delaware River watershed on the issues, actions, regulations, legislation, policy, programs, and decisions that impact the health of our Delaware River watershed, waterways, and our ability to protect and restore them for the benefit of all. We work on a lot of shale gas pipeline projects at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. We're currently working on and opposing over a dozen new pipeline or expansion projects, and the PennEast Pipeline is one of them. Keylog Economics has done some really great analysis on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and other pipelines, so we've commissioned them to do this report, and tonight we'll be hearing more about their powerful findings. I'm going to turn it over to our experts, Spencer and Sonia at Keylog in just a moment, but I wanted to go over a couple quick housekeeping points first. The webinar will be an hour long, and we're going to try and honor that time period. So we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar after Spencer and Sonia's presentation. If we have too many questions and run out of time before we get to them all, we do apologize up front for that. If you have a question come up during the webinar, please just submit it through the text box as you think of it, and I will pose the questions to Spencer and Sonia at the end and allow them to answer. We're not going to be opening up the phone lines for people to ask questions directly, so please just queue up your questions as they come to you during the presentation and put them in the text box. And please try to direct any questions to our experts while we have them here with us tonight. Okay. I just wanted to note a couple upcoming important dates before we get started as well. On March 1st from 6 to 9 p.m., the PADP is holding a public hearing on a PennEast compressor station, and we will be asking people to come out and either comment or rally, and you can find all of the basic information on that on our calendar page, and we'll have more information coming out on it soon. On March 15th, there will be a DRBC Commissioners meeting where we are planning to deliver a community comment on all of the deficiencies in the information provided by the PennEast Pipeline Company. You can find more info on how to sign up to deliver that community comment with us and contribute to our list of deficiencies on our website on our calendar page. And finally, before I pass it over, I just wanted to remind everyone that the report that Keylog is presenting tonight can also be found on our website. I'll put a link in the chat box for everyone, and we'll be sending it out tomorrow as well. We're not going to be sharing the PowerPoint from the webinar, but we are hoping to have a recording of the webinar to share in the near future. And of course, all of the information presented here can be found in the report as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Spencer and Sonia.
All right. Thank you very much, Bridget. And we will get started right away so that we can get through the high-level summary of our report and on to questions that you may have either from reading it or from what you hear here tonight. We were commissioned, as Bridget said, to do estimation of the external costs of the PennEast Pipeline as proposed and through the all of the counties that it would cross in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And that's what we're going to be summarizing here. Sonia and I are two members of the team at Keylog Economics, which is a small independent economics consultancy based in Charlottesville, Virginia. I myself am actually from the Delaware River Basin. I grew up outside of Reading, Pennsylvania, and have been living in Charlottesville recently, where Sonia and I work together on these projects. So the impetus for this is that the FERC has what on the face of it looks like a reasonable intention to evaluate all of the potential costs and benefits of pipeline proposals put before them as a request for certification. But the problem is that they just don't do that cost-benefit analysis very well or very effectively relative to the norms of economic practice and good policy making. On the one hand, FERC accepts, seemingly without question, overinflated estimates of the benefits that would come from these pipelines. The benefits are overestimated for a variety of reasons, including that they apply methods that are designed to estimate short-term benefits and assume that those same benefits are going to occur over the long term when they would be dissipated. And also they're based on what may be very rosy scenarios for what some of the jobs and income effects of the pipeline construction and operation would be, both in the short and in the long term. But again, FERC seems to accept those estimates without question. It doesn't do its own homework on the benefit side of things, as it were. On the cost side, there is a full range of costs that occur anytime you do anything on the landscape, whether it's a housing development or building a road or building a pipeline or changing the landscape in some way is going to have effects, and they're going to have impacts that are nearby, and they're going to have impacts that are widely distributed across the landscape, and some of them actually across the entire globe. But FERC more or less puts its head in the sand and pretends that impacts that occur anywhere outside the right-of-way itself don't exist, ignoring existing studies to this effect or on this topic, and simply economic common sense. In particular, what the FERC policy does is it assumes away any adverse effects that are beyond the right-of-way. What it says in its guidance on evaluating pipelines is that a pipeline company that somehow managed, if they were to manage to obtain the right-of-way or to purchase easements for the entire right-of-way, then FERC would assume that there are no further adverse impacts. So in other words, if you can compensate the landowners whose land you're going to dig up and stick the pipeline in, that's fine. And there's nothing else going on. So the landowners who are right next door don't matter. People who live within the evacuation zone don't matter. People who live downstream, where there might be siltation, or people who live in a place where their view has been marred by the scar in the landscape, those people don't matter in FERC's calculus of cost of pipeline. Moreover, FERC relies entirely on the pipeline applicant to tell them about benefits and costs, and they discount information that comes from independent sources such as ours or Delaware Riverkeeper Network and others. They say, and I will quote, that it is FERC's policy for the applicant to develop whatever record is necessary and for the Commission to impose whatever conditions are necessary for the Commission to be able to find that the benefits to the public from the project outweigh the adverse impact on the relevant interests. So in other words, FERC is telling the applicant to tell the FERC what the applicant wants FERC to hear so that FERC can tell the applicant what the applicant wants to hear. And while that might serve the purpose of getting pipelines certified and possibly built, it doesn't serve the purpose of meeting the public's interest in an economically efficient level of pipeline capacity or the protection of the public from the adverse economic and other effects of these projects. So with the details on how one would, in a more comprehensive and complete and economically valid way, estimate some of those costs, I'm going to turn things over to Sonia Wang, and she'll tell you about our methods and our findings.
Hi, everyone. So for our study, we looked at three main things. We looked at ecosystem services, and these are the benefits people obtain from ecosystems, property values, and how they might be impacted along the right-of-way, within the evacuation zone, and within a half a mile around the compressor station, and the social cost of carbon, an estimate that tries to quantify the economic harm due to carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions. Using land cover data, we found that the most impacted ecosystems were forest, cropland, pasture, and forage land. When these intact tracts of land are converted to barren land during the one-year construction period, the ecosystem losses range from 6.3 to 22.1 million. Annually, ecosystem services lost in the right-of-way and from other permanent infrastructure translate to $2.6 to $9.8 million loss, which would occur for the lifetime of the pipeline and its associated infrastructure. So here's a graph showing the ecosystem services we estimated and the losses in the right-of-way. As you can see, we look at a full range of ecosystem services like aesthetic value, climate regulation, and recreation, to name a few. We took estimates from existing independent studies on pipelines and other related infrastructure to examine the property value impacts along the PennEast Pipeline. We estimate that the properties in the right-of-way, which currently have a combined value of $200.5 million, could potentially lose between $8.4 and $26.1 million. As Spencer was saying, FERC is willing to ignore all costs outside the right-of-way, and these would be the only impacts FERC would consider. FERC would completely ignore the effects on landowners in the evacuation zone, which is the area one would have to leave to avoid being harmed in the event of a pipeline leak or explosion. Properties within this evacuation zone, which have a combined value of $3.9 billion, could potentially lose $149.9 million. Then there's a separate issue of the compressor station. Properties within a half mile of the compressor station, which would have a combined value of $5.6 million, could potentially lose $1.4 million. Due to this drop in property value, local governments would lose between $2.7 and $3 million every year in property tax revenue for as long as the PennEast Pipeline is operating. Combustion of the gas that the PennEast Pipeline would transport would also impose a further cost that can be measured as the so-called social cost of carbon. The PennEast Pipeline would result in the emission of the equivalent of 21.3 metric tons of carbon every year. That cost of those carbon emissions varies depending on how deeply one discounts future impacts. So, for example, at a 5% discount rate, the cost would be $12.9 billion. At a lower discount rate, which means the future matters more, the cost would be $56 billion. There are other costs that are important for FERC to consider. However, due to data limitations, we cannot provide cost estimates. These costs include, but are not limited to, public health effects associated with the compressor station, visual effects, community service costs, and effects on economic development. Compressor stations have also been associated with various human health impacts at distances up to 2 miles away from the station. Unfortunately, due to a lack of epidemiological research, we are not able to include the public health costs in our report, but we are able to estimate the potential public health impacts for the 560 people living within 2 miles of the proposed compressor station in Carbon County. So out of these 560 people, for example, 504 people could experience odor events, 398 people would experience respiratory impacts, 325 people would experience sinus problems, and 218 people could experience sleep disturbances and or severe headaches. Another very important thing to consider is visibility. The PennEast Pipeline would also create an unnatural feature on the landscape. While information about visual effects on natural gas transmission lines is also scarce, it's important to know the places where the pipeline could potentially be visible in the study region. To determine this visibility, we conducted a GIS visibility analysis to determine that the PennEast Pipeline right-of-way could potentially be seen by 35% of the study region. Or in other words, about 1 kilometer of the right-of-way would be visible from roughly 20% of the study region. And if you would like to see a larger picture of the map, it is in our report. The construction and operation of the pipeline would also likely impose various costs on local governments and thus by extension, local taxpayers. We examined 4 main community service costs that we think may be impacted more than the draft environmental impact statement is claiming. We are unable to quantify the costs due to a lack of existing research on pipelines and community services, but we recommend FERC examine more thoroughly the impacts on the provision of public and private water, for example, roads and traffic, and how they might be impacted in local communities, emergency services, fire, rescue, and emergency medical services, as well as law enforcement. The PennEast Pipeline could potentially dampen or undermine the economic development of the counties impacted due to the loss of scenic and recreational amenities, the perception and the reality of physical danger, and environmental and property damage resulting from the project. If this were to occur, this could discourage people from visiting, relocating, or staying in the region, as workers, businesses, or retirees who might have other chosen to locate or to build a family along the proposed route instead pick different locations that retain their character, productive, healthy landscapes, and a promise for a higher quality of life. For these results, we used scenarios to estimate how the PennEast could potentially impact economic development. So just looking at recreation and tourism, if there were a 10% decrease in spending, our scenario, you could expect a loss of $448 million, a loss of 4,090 jobs, and $38.8 million in local and state tax revenue. This also would occur if slower growth in retirees and entrepreneurs were to occur. If that occurred, then there would also be reduced non-labor income, reduced proprietors and wage and salary income, and fewer jobs each year. And this would occur for as long as the PennEast Pipeline is in operation. And I'm now going to turn it over to Spencer to sum up the rest of the project.
Thank you, Sonia. So just to recap, there are from what we were able to estimate, Sonia just told you some of the things that should be counted, that FERC really, to do its job completely, should commission studies or do studies that take into account the full range of external costs on people and communities. But we, taking this stab at the things that we could estimate from available data, there's two kinds of costs. There's things that happen once, so losses in asset value and losses in ecosystem service value during the construction period. And as you can see here, we've got property value losses would be between $160 and $177.3 million. So that's a one-time reduction in the value of homes along the pipeline route and within the evacuation zone. And then ecosystem service value, that would be foregone during the construction period, $6.3 million to $22.1 million during that construction period. And then the recurring costs are a drop in property tax revenue due to the initial loss in housing value, home value, and ecosystem service reductions that are the result of having converted highly productive ecosystems or highly productive land cover types like forests or cropland into less productive cover types. Most of the acres involved are going to be forests, which are really good at sequestering carbon, filtering water, providing wildlife habitat, scenic beauty, recreational opportunities, and that when that becomes shrub-scrub at best, or maybe grassland, the land just doesn't do as much to provide beneficial services to people. And then finally, the social cost of carbon, again, is a result of the ultimate combustion of the gas that would flow through this pipeline, and those costs are imposed upon people worldwide in the form of rising sea level and crop damage and disease and everything else. And according to U.S. government procedures that we followed to estimate this, you've got between $291 and $608 million per year if you're paying less attention to future impacts, and if you pay a little bit more attention, you're between 1.5 and 2.3 billion per year. So those really add up. And again, to reiterate, what we want to do is compare, what we want FERC to do is compare as full as possible an accounting of the external cost of this pipeline, the social cost of this pipeline, to what it or the pipeline proponents put forward as estimates of what the social benefits would be, which are, of course, are different from the private benefits and profits. I will do want to note, though, that with regard to our estimates, we are being as conservative as possible. As we've gone through this, there are oftentimes ranges of estimates that could be employed. We take the low end of those ranges and put them into our estimates here. Also, we are, again, not counting some significant costs that could be significant, cost of community services, firefighting, planning for emergencies, as well as other things that could happen, secondary ecosystem service losses. We have considered only the ecosystem service cost, for example, that occurs due to the conversion of land. But if there is a landslide, if there is an event, if there is a leak and an explosion, that results in further damage to ecosystems, there would be additional ecosystem service losses. And then finally, human health impacts for which we just need to have more epidemiological study to be able to put that into dollars and cents. So I think the chat box is open for questions, and I will just go to, we've got the link to the report here on the final slide if anybody would like to type that in and go grab it.
We'll give you a few moments to come up with some questions, and then here we go. We have one here.
Okay, so is there any evidence that tax assessors really reduce value of property impacted by the pipeline, or is it considered an asset and thus an improvement in the value of the property? On your answer?
Yeah, I'll take that on. I would definitely suggest that you read the report. We go into a great bit of detail on the evidence from various surveys of realtors, of potential home buyers, and of comparisons of assessed value on and off pipeline right-of-ways. There's a group called the Forensics Appraisal Group, which does this stuff all the time, and that's where some of the information comes from that we incorporated into our study. So the answer is yes, assessors do reduce property values when there is a right-of-way, a pipeline right-of-way on the property. It's very much like if you have a utility corridor for a electric transmission line or anything else. There's a piece of your property that is no longer yours to use as you choose. It is, and the pipeline company has the right to do whatever they need to do to operate the pipeline on your property. So naturally, that reduces your enjoyment of the property. It reduces the usefulness of the property in whatever, if you're using it for farm or forestry production, for example, you're not going to be able to use it in the same way. If it was a forest, you can never grow trees in that strip of land again, so you lose that asset value. The pipeline itself is certainly an asset, but it's not an asset for the landowner. It is an asset for the pipeline company, and it is literally their property, and is not an improvement for the landowner at all. And then, in addition to what shows up in the marketplace as a reduction in property value and sale prices, which is there is ample evidence of that in the literature that we cite in our study, one can simply not enjoy their property as much, and there's an economic loss that's over and above what the hit they might take when they go to sell their home. Good question.
Great. Okay, so next question. Did you find any areas or segments that were either very high or very low in terms of immediate impacts, land use, ecosystems, particular species?
I would say that the data contained that level of specificity. I see somebody too asked about the GIS analysis. We did the GIS analysis. We had some great help from Stephen Metz in getting some of the initial GIS layers, the visibility analysis, the overlay of the pipeline construction and right-of-way corridors with the land cover data, the evaluation of the pipeline right-of-way construction zone, high consequence area, and evacuation zone with respect to the location of parcels. That was all GIS work that we did at Keylog Economics. And so we did do GIS beyond the viewshed analysis, but back to the initial question that Bridget asked, we could theoretically or quite easily actually go in and identify the cost for any given parcel, the estimated cost impact on any given parcel, as well as the lost ecosystem service value at any point along the pipeline. So yes, but if our report had all of that detail, it would run to many times the number of pages that it does now.
Okay. Is there one value that can be used per unit for cost of carbon, or is it many factors with different costs?
It is different factors. Again, if you go to the works cited and read the summary of the methods that we used in our study, what an interagency working group the federal government has done is created a tool for estimating the social cost of carbon. And you can pick and choose which discount rate you're going to use in that analysis. And so that's one of the things that results in ranges of impacts. Also embedded in the tool are many, many different modeling runs of how much effect the release of a ton of carbon in any particular year would have on human health and property damages and extreme weather events and all of the sort of things that tend to feed back on human well-being and therefore economic value. So there's all kinds of complexity and ranges of information that goes into those estimates. And what we did, we took a sort of a mid-range estimate, which is the 2.5% discount rate, and we took a low-range estimate, which is the 5% discount rate, and we presented those as possibilities.
Okay. Next question. Can your property value losses be translated to a percentage of value to illustrate potential loss for individual landowners?
Yes. You could easily we could do that from the results that we got, but also, and Sonia, you can augment my specific memory on this. When you're looking at the right-of-way, for example, the estimate that we used, which is based on a buyer survey, is approximately 10%. It's a weighted average of the people who, 60% of the people who, upon learning that a property would be encumbered by a pipeline right-of-way easement, would not buy the property at all. And then of the remaining 40% of the people, about half of them said they would pay 20% less, and the other half said it wouldn't have any effect on their offer price, and therefore, on average, you can expect to lose 10% of your value. Those are round numbers. In the evacuation zone, where the impact on landowner concerns and therefore on property values in the market is that 24/7, 365, you never know if you're going to have to get up and leave your house in order to avoid what is called the effects of the thermal flux, or which is to say, so that you don't get burned and get out of the evacuation zone. And so obviously living under those conditions can impose stress and make properties less attractive for potential buyers. And within that zone, it's a little bit north of 3% is the impact.
Okay. There are a couple of questions about revenue to the state and landowners. One is asking what revenue, if any, does the state get from the pipeline and the county as well? And another is asking, does the pipeline produce income for the right-of-way landowners?
For the landowners, yeah.
Yeah.
For the landowners, depending on how the transaction or how the agreement is reached with the pipeline company, you could sell or receive a lease payment for the easement. What you would be doing is you're granting an easement, again, use of that portion of your property for which you could receive some compensation. Landowners who do not enter into an agreement prior to the granting of certification would then face the possibility that the property could be taken as eminent domain, and then there would be an arbitrated value that they would receive for, the inconvenience of having the pipeline on their property. When it comes to state and local governments, it is rather opaque to us how exactly the compensation or any revenue is figure, and it varies from state to state. New Jersey has one system. Pennsylvania has a different one. Perhaps while we're getting to the next question, Sonia, if you could pull up what those estimates are for what the PennEast could potentially deliver to state and local governments, that might be handy. But it is covered in the report.
Okay. There's another question relating to funding. Actually, someone has asked, does PennEast have all the funding it needs to carry out this project, or are there ways that citizens can act to defund the project? Not sure if that falls under it.
Are there ways that citizens can do what?
Can act to defund the project.
Oh, I can't answer the first one. I mean, it is a privately funded project. It is the PennEast Pipeline LLC spending its capital or proposing to expend its capital to build the pipeline. So it doesn't depend on citizen funding. Where the citizens' voices need to be heard is in the environmental reviews that are mandated under the National Environmental Policy Act, of which the analysis of the effects on the human environment, including on the economy, are required by law to be included. And it is really at that point of connection where information such as in this study and other testimony from individual citizens about the effect on their lives and livelihoods and well-being should matter to the agency.
Can you talk at all about the health risks of the pipelines or the dangers of leaks and explosions?
Yes. But anybody watching the news knows that pipelines tend to leak and explode with some frequency, and it's not. It is almost impossible to say what the probability of a leak or explosion at any given point along any particular pipeline would be. But some research from other organizations has shown that pipelines that have been constructed recently have as high a rate of failure and explosion as pipelines that were constructed 50, 60 years ago, which you would expect out of the old ones because they're corroding and things wear out. But the new ones possibly are being built either more rapidly. They're also generally operating at higher volumes and higher pressures, which might not be really suitable for the materials and the technology involved. That is really kind of an engineering question beyond my expertise. But the fact of the matter is, they do leak and they do explode, and if they leak, they will explode because the gas is under such high pressure that the motion of rocks against each other underground is going to produce some sparks. You have a source of ignition. And the health risks of that are all the things that you would expect would come from a very hot fire in a particular location. It is why what is called the high consequence area for a pipeline of this size and operated under this pressure would be about 2/3 of a mile wide, and why the evacuation zone is about 1.4 miles wide. And as a former volunteer firefighter, I can tell you that any kind of natural gas event is something nobody wants to be anywhere near.
Okay, we have a question from someone who's fighting the Nexus Pipeline, which is set to run from Ohio to Canada. Okay, sorry. So we can actually guide anyone who's looking for more information on the Nexus Pipeline to our website, stopthepipelines.org. We have information there to connect with different battlers working against that pipeline. So. Okay. Another question, how do the proposed heavy haul roads fit into your calculation?
I'm going to let Sonia take that one. The question is really about whether the extent to which we included those temporary access roads and other types of infrastructure in our ecosystem services evaluation.
Hi. So what we did was PennEast in the research reports gave us their access road data, and we didn't digitize every single access road because that would take way too long. So what we did was they gave us land cover, so the existing access road type. So this is probably going to be either, grass or gravel. And what we did is we looked at only the new, either temporary or permanent access roads, because these are the roads that will have the most ecosystem value impact. And what we did was we looked at what existing land type it was. We assumed that they would be converted to barren because it would be a road. And then depending on whether it's temporary or permanent, we use that to factor it into our cost estimates.
So the short answer is we did consider them. We didn't count and all we counted was what was going to be new, what would actually be a change in land use. If there's a road that was being improved slightly, or if there was a road that was being that was going to be used for the construction and so forth, but it was already a road, it was already, for example, not being a forest, and therefore there wasn't a change in the ecosystem service productivity of that piece of the landscape.
Okay. Someone has asked, is there a way to give value to the economic impact of this project on future generations?
Well, not necessarily directly. However, some of the costs which will be experienced in the future, including the social cost of carbon that occurs 10, 20 years into the future, does take some future effects into account. The ecosystem service value that will be lost year by year by year in the right-of-way is counted in our estimation, although we didn't go to the extent of trying to speculate about how much less future generations will value, truly future generations will value the landscape. But we did, some things, however, will be perpetual. The lack of natural land cover in the pipeline right-of-way is going to become a permanent feature of the landscape, and so to that extent we did cover those future effects.
Okay. And can you speak at all to the economic impacts of the long-term effect when groundwater and well water is contaminated?
Only at a conceptual level. We did not estimate those beyond the, well, we estimated water quality impacts resulting from the change in land cover. So as I was saying before, the extent to which shrub or scrub or barren land doesn't do as good a job at filtering and retaining water as the forest. And so there's an impact on groundwater recharge, and there's an impact on surface water quality as well. The thing that is not included, though, is if, for example, because the pipeline will be constructed in part over karst terrain, for example, there is a possibility that the blasting, the digging, and so forth could cause effects on groundwater, changing on subsurface transport of water, and cause people to potentially lose their wells. That's one of those things where one would have to have extremely detailed information about the probability of that sort of event happening at any point, and how far away every well is to that point, and it gets into numbers that are beyond the scope of what we were able to do in this study. And I see the question about the distinction between heavy haul roads and access roads, and I understand what you're saying here, Ms. Brown. We did, it's true, we covered the change in land use for the new construction of roads to service the pipeline, either to construct the pipeline or service the pipeline. And as Sonia was saying, though, there were some local community service costs that we were not able to include, and that would, within that category, would be the idea that heavy equipment going over roads that possibly was not that were not constructed in the first place to take that kind of punishment, that's going to be some slack that the local governments are going to have to pick up and reconstruct the roads or reinforce the roads or repair the road damage after the construction is completed. However, that is an area where the applicant has said that they do intend to make counties whole on that score.
Mm-hmm. Someone's asked if you can talk about the life cycle of a pipeline, who's responsible for maintenance and testing, and the remediation at the end of the cycle.
I can talk about the life cycle. So I was actually able to get into email contact with a representative, and they said that the PennEast Pipeline would safely transport enough natural gas for several decades. So we interpreted several decades as about 30 years from the year of construction.
And so that is the period over which we counted the social cost of carbon. We didn't assume there would be gas flowing beyond that. And that probably aligns with how long one might expect the Marcellus Shale resource to be utilized at this rate anyway. As for the second half of that question. It would be, who's responsible for testing? I don't know. That might actually involve state and county and local government entities. I can tell you that in the case of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, it has been a large concern for counties and municipalities who have found that they can't really rely on the state of Virginia's Department of Environmental Conservation to be able to do all the monitoring of pipeline construction that they should, and therefore some communities are anticipating the need to spend their own money to do testing and monitoring. And as far as remediation goes, that is the responsibility of the company, and my understanding is that the typical solution, the typical method of decommissioning a pipeline is to decommission it in place, which is to say all of the infrastructure is just going to sit there and rust. So there wouldn't necessarily be a restoration up to forest or of any other land use, land cover.
Right. Okay, we have a question asking, what can one do to get FERC to consider cost in a realistic manner?
Comment.
Right.
Read this report, identify the couple of points that you find are most interesting and important to you, and write a comment letter to FERC saying, I'm concerned about the impact on property value throughout the length of the PennEast Pipeline, and here's why. Maybe you live within the evacuation zone, maybe you live close to the right-of-way, or maybe you know that your view shed is going to be impacted, and tell them that it matters to you, and also tell them that FERC has an obligation under the National Environmental Policy Act to consider all of the effects on the human environment. And you were writing to them about the effects on your little corner of the human environment, and you want them to take that into account. And then we see what happens at the final environmental impact statement stage of things, and go from there.
Awesome. And I would just add to that to use all of the valuable information in this new report in any public comment, whether it's written or oral, to FERC, but also to the DEP for the now open comment period on the compressor station, as well as to the DRBC, and to bring it to the March 15th meeting for that as well, to share it with any elected officials to help inform them, inform your friends, your neighbors, your family, and just get this information out there as much as possible.
Good. I see Mr. DeWalt's question down at the end, and it does go back to that question of property values. And I'll read from our report here. This is summing up, and of course there's other materials that might go to the point of what value, if any, goes to the residents of the county or of the state. I will, and this is how we sum things up, and this is in page 43 of our report. And after giving a summary of the cost, we say, by contrast, the pipeline would, in the words of FERC's draft environmental impact statement, provide only, quote, minor, unquote, benefits in the form of economic impact during construction and operation of the pipeline. Using PennEast's own estimates and applying the same methods to calculate the present value of all future benefits, the pipeline's promises a total of $2.3 billion in impact over 30 years of operation. So comparing that to the cost that we estimated, remembering that our costs are estimated very conservatively, that means for every dollar of benefit promised by PennEast, the pipeline would impose between $5.85 and $24.97 in costs on the people. So a really lousy cost-benefit ratio. So in answer to your question, there would be some benefits to residents. Some people might get jobs helping with construction. Somebody might get a job working on the operation of the pipeline. Some landowners might find that what they're paid as compensation for the right-of-way is in fact a good deal for them. But on the whole, and when considering the cost to all of the people who would be affected, again, you're going to, for every dollar that comes in, you're going to be losing between $6 and $25 in costs going out.
Okay, we have two related questions. One is asking if you've examined any agreements with landowners to analyze the degree of responsibility PennEast will assume after they leave your property. It seems as though they wash their hands of any after effects of the project. And the other is asking if wells are not able to be used from the pipeline, who will pay for new drinking water and for how long?
So I can touch on the well question if you would like to do that first. Spencer, or would you like to do the other? Sure. So if you look at page 36 on our report, the provision of public and private water is a community service cost that we looked into, but we were unable to directly quantify the cost. And this is an issue that the entire region is worried about, especially in Pennsylvania where so many people rely on well water. The EPA has actually submitted a comment letter outlining drinking water concerns and the inadequacies from the DEIS regarding private and public water. But PennEast has prepared a well plan stating that the company would conduct pre- and post-construction water quality monitoring, but this is only within 150 feet of the construction corridor, which from our report, we recognize that that is too small of an estimate for impacts. Like we said, the evacuation zone is about 1.4 miles. So if you're thinking about subsurface geology and water, it's going to move much quicker, or you're not necessarily knowing exactly how it is going to move. So there have been concerns for that the 150 feet buffer does not protect all potentially impacted landowners. And in response to this, even the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection has requested that this is an inadequate monitoring radius and that they increase it to 1,000. So as of now, since that final environmental impact statement hasn't come out yet, I think that the PennEast is pretty much going to be responsible for testing 150 feet within the construction corridor unless FERC deems that they must increase their monitoring radius.
Good. And as for the deeds themselves, I have not examined any deeds for this particular pipeline. I have seen sample deeds for other similar pipelines, including the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And my impression is similar to yours, is that there is very little that remains the responsibility of the pipeline company, typically. But every easement is a different document, and negotiating the terms of that may or may not be somewhat under the control of the landowner, the individual landowner.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left for questions, but a couple more to get to. Someone has asked, was consideration given to indirect impacts to businesses dependent on agricultural operations, such as horse farms? For example, if the horses are moved away from the pipeline impacted by the farm, local veterinarians and feed and tax stores would suffer. Also, with the loss of valuable hay producing farmland, quality hay would have to be brought in from other areas at a greater cost.
Good points. The latter piece of that, the change in hay production, at least during construction, is accounted for in our study. That's one of those food production from pasture and hayland is built into the ecosystem service valuation component. Now, it is true that the land under which the pipeline will go can revert to pasture or hayland afterwards, whether it remains practical for a grower to continue to manage land for hay or as pasture with the pipeline in place is another matter. But theoretically, it could produce hay again once land is recovered, and if there has not been a significant change in the productivity due to soil compaction, which we recognize could be an additional problem, but we did not add that to the cost that we estimated. Again, we've been very conservative and took into account only the things that we're quite sure would definitely happen. As for indirect impacts on other businesses, that is taking us even farther into not the realm of speculation that it would happen, but difficulty in estimating the extent to which it would happen. And so those kind of impacts are likely to occur, but we did not include those in the study itself. Sonia talked towards the end of her presentation about the effects of loss of retirement income, loss of income from entrepreneurs, sole proprietors, and the loss of recreation and tourism dollars. So the idea being that if the area is no longer attractive to folks who would come and spend either their retirement income or set up a business or spend their vacation time and money in the region, then there would be losses for the overall economy. And the same is true if agriculture becomes less viable, and then you lose all those support services as well. So that's an possibly important component of the overall cost, but it is not one that we felt that we had sufficient information available to provide an estimate.
Okay. Can you talk at all about the negative impacts from emissions from compressor stations on pasturage and farm and garden crops, for example, being 1.5 miles away?
A little bit. I know that the literature that we have reviewed and some of the stories we have read about the effects of compressor stations, particularly with the blowdown and the release of large volumes of the fracked gas itself and whatever might have come along with it by compressor stations, is at least anecdotally related to some changes in the quality of orchard production and other effects. We only really got into some of the human health effects, the nosebleeds, asthma, and so forth that one would expect closer to compressor stations, and also, of course, the effect on property values. The impact on agricultural production of various kinds is definitely an area that needs further research, and I feel like I've been saying that to you all too many times, and I'm sorry that the research has not been done, but in part that's part of the travesty, really, of the way these pipeline approval processes go. It is up to FERC by law to figure out what these impacts are and to understand and estimate how great they are, both in biophysical terms, how many people will get sick, how many crops will be damaged, and also what that means for economic effects. But they don't do it. They don't do that job. And so it's left to folks like Delaware Riverkeeper Network and other citizens groups to come along and say, hey, here's what you should be doing. Here's the kind of questions you should be asking. And oh, by the way, if you were to take even a conservative approach, such as we did here in this study, the costs are really significant. And if you were then to take, our cost estimates and add on all the other costs that really should be considered, pretty soon we're talking about a situation where it really doesn't seem to make sense to build these things in the first place.
Okay, thank you, Spencer and Sonia. I think we're getting to about the end of our time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webinar tonight. We will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone that has links to the report as well as all of the other things that we mentioned linking to. And we will let everyone know as soon as we know about sharing the recording of the webinar as well, hopefully soon. All right.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.